Forum. Plenary Session 4 revolves around the theme of rethinking economic diversification, safeguarding the lives and livelihoods of future generations. On the outset, I was asked, being a moderator of this plenary session, to set forth a couple of points on this theme. I have jotted down these points in English, but I shall simultaneously translate them into Arabic. In ESCWA's final report on rethinking financial policies in the Arab region, the report tackled the instrumental role of financial policies in having structural change and diversifying Arab economies, all the while taking into account the importance of this shift in the economic structures in order to achieve future benefits in terms of economic growth and further productivity in the Arab region. This report was pivotal in raising such issues, mainly in terms of financial policies. Indeed, the Arab countries' financial policies, as is the case in the whole world, went further towards austerity and lesser spending. As for the economic diversification in the Arab world, allow me to raise 4 pillars. Firstly, the Arab world faces some sort of major decline in natural resources. This was measured in one of the scientific reports done by the economist Kenneth Arrow and others. Not only investment in general was measured, but also the real effective investment in the Arab region after deducting from the investment process the exploitation of the natural resources. It was evident that in the Arab region between 1997 and 2001, the percentage of real investment minus was rather less, with 7% of the true levels, despite the fact that the investment levels were high in the Arab region. But once we deduct the consumption of natural resources, the real investment turns into a negative factor. Furthermore, the growth of what was identified as the real resource reached 3.83% of GDP. Therefore, our Arab region faces a real dilemma. The exploitation of natural resources follows a faster pace than the construction of the real investment for longer periods of time in the long run. Let us take the example of China. The growth percentage of the real source was 3.83 approximately during the same period of time. And if we follow the same pathway, the Arab region will be facing some sort of a chronic delay. Secondly, when we speak of economic diversification, one important question surfaces. Where can we attract investments for this economic diversification? Shall we rely solely on free markets? Shall we rely solely on the package of reforms that were called for a long time by what was called the Washington Consensus? If we take the countries where industrialization started late, such as China or the Soviet Union, this was done through a process of shifting resources from one sector to the sector of industry. Here comes the role of the Soviet thinker Brzezinski, when he said in the late 20s of the last decade that it was possible to change Russia, that in the 1917 was an agricultural economy, and how it can be turned into an industrial economy. And therefore, he suggested that the agricultural sector can be exploited through terms of trade policies that can eventually entail in a better growth of the economy in the communist countries. In the Arab region, when we ponder diversification, we should not only think in a general way, but we need to ask ourselves, where can we attract resources from? These resources that must be turned into the sectors that we would like to update. We know that in the Arab region, the in-kind economy reigns supreme, whether from a financial economy or in-kind economy. Therefore, diversification means that we need to take the economy from these sorts of economies to industrialization. Thirdly, when we speak of diversification, it is of utmost importance to broach also industrialization. Diversification in general may not unfurl into economic growth, despite the fact that in the late 30s, diversification used even to be in the sector of services. However, according to recent economic studies, mostly for the economists such as Danny Roderick and Haj Mokshan, they say that the core of creating economic growth, wealth, and economic advancement is or lies within manufacturing. Therefore, this remains the pioneering sector for any economic diversification and growth. In the Arab region, we do need a quantum leap in order to achieve higher levels of manufacturing. We can even resort to all underlying potentials encompassing the informal sector in order to have manufacturing levels. We might even turn to lesser profit percentages in this manufacturing process. Furthermore, the increase of growth in ways that the economic growth can even increase more than the revenue of the in-kind capital economy, as Thomas Piketty said, in a way that we will be constantly getting rid of any economic collapse or deterioration and moving towards a new economy. Finally, who will be spearheading this process, the process of diversification? Which country will lead this process, and which advanced segments of society will also partake to this diversification? We see that we have a core dilemma in the Arab region. Despite the economic growth and advancement that this region has witnesses, no economic productive layers or classes have been induced in order to incentivize a better economic diversification and a productive economy. This is instrumental when we tackle the issue of diversification. We need to know what are the castes, which states will be spearheading the process of economic diversification, which is not an easy process to undertake. Evidently, the states that have already taken steps towards late manufacturing have done so at a higher social, economic, and political costs. Now, in our panel, we have a plethora of different speakers from the private sector to the public sector to the academia as well, and the civil society organizations. I would like to welcome first and foremost His Excellency Mr. Hassan Janabi, who is currently a Minister of Water Resources in the Republic of Iraq. He was previously Minister of Iraq in Japan and a former consultant at the sector of water resources and public works in Baghdad. Mr. Janabi is holder of a bachelor's degree in engineering from University of Baghdad and a master's degree from Warsaw and from the University of Technology in Sydney. The floor is yours. Every speaker has 10 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Ghassan. I would like to express my happiness to be amongst you here today. I would like to extend my thanks to ESQA, to Mr. Mohammed Hakim, to Mrs. Rula, and Mrs. Carol, who continue to cooperate with me personally. I am not an economic expert as Mr. Ghassan. Mr. Ghassan has broached a comprehensive, holistic topic, if I may say. I will be versing into Iraq's experience. It might be more relevant. I was supposed to participate to another session, but Mrs. Rula wanted that I participate in the panel of economic diversification. There are some matters that I can tackle in this regard, certainly. As you all know, Iraq is a country that may not be a role model to follow for the implementation of any economic or non-economic principle, due to the recent dramatic history that shook the foundations of Iraq in light of the different major political shifts that occurred, and because of the series of wars that the country had to encounter. Iraq was previously a water resources rich country up until recently. All the water resources of the Euphrates and the Tigris used to prevail in Iraq, and now gradually we see that these water resources are expeditedly depleting, and I believe we need to change our view in dealing with the available water resources. Furthermore, we were fortunate, or maybe unfortunate, to have oil related resources. This oil wealth was supposed to be a catalyst for economic growth and sustainability. However, due to the misuse of these resources, they turned into a catalyst for conflict in the region. Therefore, as Dr. Ghassan said, there was an overexploitation of these resources without being in line with a real effective economy, and it is highly evident in Iraq. The discovery of these oil resources and the high prices further provided financial sources for a totalitarian regime that wasn't really in favor of economy, but it was more focused on warlike ideologies that led to a war-torn Iraq. We relied also on these oil resources within this in-kind economy. It was easy to attract cash, and so there was a great migration from the rural areas to the capital. Previously, Iraq used to be an agricultural country, but we no longer consider ourselves in this category. Therefore, this migration from the rural areas to the urban areas was motivated by this influx of money. Thus, we have lost our agricultural initiatives and activities in the rural areas, and we were able to have this urbanization of the cities, which led to a greater decrease in services that later on totally collapsed because of wars and because of the destruction of infrastructure. Once this migration from the rural areas to the urban areas happens, we dare say that our loss is double-fold, because you will be losing a producer of food, of agricultural source, who turns into a consumer of this source, and thus more pressure is exerted. Previously, Iraq relied on large-scale companies, on the public sector, and it hoped that these companies will pave the way for an economic upturn in the country, but this was not the case. In the new system, we have inherited a great number of large-scale companies employing unproductive huge numbers of staff or employees, and these companies are no longer productive and no longer competitive with any neighboring country due to the opening of the frontiers. I know that the time allotted to me is somewhat restricted, but I would like to give you a real picture of the status quo in Iraq. Up until recently, the treasury was not only empty, but it was merely inexistent, and the collapse reached levels that had to be an awakening call for us to induce a change. Therefore, there was a focus on lessening the spending. Serious efforts were exerted in order to diversify the Iraqi economy away from the sole reliance on the oil revenues. As we all know, the oil revenues collapsed from $120 to less than $30. So I believe Iraq relied up to 95% on oil revenues, and we really had to change this mindset. So less spending was hurtful, at least in terms of investment, because our budget was not void of investment, yet the government was able to safeguard the salaries of employees. We know that they might be somewhat inflated, but there was no other way to deal with the new realities on the ground. One of the most important procedures that the government has carried out once the oil prices collapsed in 2014 and later on, we had large-scale projects that were being implemented within Iraq. And once these prices collapsed, the state was no longer able to finance these projects. Therefore, these projects were somewhat semi-completed, and these were large-scale, multi-million-dollar projects. And the investors were heading these projects, whether foreign investors or local Iraqi investors. Therefore, our investment budget, which was affiliated to the ministry, turned to the financing of the contractors' dues, because we know that we cannot induce progress in economy in the absence of contractors who are able to create job opportunities and entrench a progress. And I believe this was a safe and sound procedure. We were able to pay in the first year up to 40%. When you have a broke state, you cannot achieve progress. This is why it was an instrumental procedure. We paid 40% in the first year and 30% in the second year, and this year 30%. Therefore, the government's main task revolved around safeguarding this segment of society that is able to bring growth into our economy. I am responsible for water resources, and I'm specialized in this file. The idea of water resources within economic diversification is definitely linked to food security as well as energy security. I believe the correlation amid all these three elements, this nexus, is extremely instrumental, and this is why ESQA is helping Iraq in better using the available water resources. And the water resources are less than 50% in comparison to the past or 2 or 3 decades ago. At the same time, the demand on these resources increased double-fold and even threefold because of the increased number of population. I still have 2 minutes, so I will speak fastly. Now we realize that this country that is totally devastated, this environment that is totally deteriorated, and the expansion of populations used to have a lot of water resources with a normal runoff, but nowadays the runoff of the Euphrates and the Tigris is a runoff controlled by the neighboring countries. Therefore, we have facilities that were created in order to have better control. Therefore, every drop that goes through the channels is under the control of neighboring countries. Henceforth, the idea of sustainability, whether in terms of water resources, in order to achieve rural development, or in terms of the wetlands in Iraq, these huge surfaces of water in Iraq that were established since the dawn of times and that were listed on the international heritage that has to be safeguarded. And we are currently preoccupied with these wetlands in light of the severe drought that we are facing in our country. We are suffering not only in light of the decreased water and financial resources, but also because of this shift of the society from a water resources rich society to a society that suffers from depletion. We speak of cities and sustainability for future generations. I do believe that this is a major challenge. It ranks first on Iraqi's challenges. There are major cities that do not have even survival conditions. Therefore, the government must think of ways to create new cities in order to transfer these populations into these cities to be able to survive. Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency, for your presentation. The next speaker is Mr. Muhammad Saidam, who is currently senior researcher at the Royal Scientific Society and is an advisor for research and science. He was a director of the UNDP program. Mr. Saidam is holder of a PhD degree in environmental engineering and water resources engineering from the University of Technology and Medicine in London.
أول شيء بشكر الإسكوا على التنظيم.
Thank you, Mr. Ghassan. We would like to thank ESCWA for their organization of this important forum in Beirut. I am not an economist like Mr. Ghassan. I am a specialist in water resources and I have worked for a long time in this field, but currently I work in the field of sustainable development, mainly in the light of the fact that I am a member of the committee responsible for implementing the SDGs in Jordan. There's also the Inter-Academy Partnership, a paramount project to link academia to decision makers. It was evident that there's a dire need to draw a lot of attention to this issue, more than before. I would like to ask, how many academics do we have in this hall? Can you please raise your hands? I need to know the percentage of academics present here, because I am certain that we have a great number of government representatives, because they are the ones implementing, by the end of the day, the agenda. But are there any researchers or academics that are present here? Therefore, as we can see, we need to have a new vision because the demands, the international demands to achieve sustainable development require the correlation of science with the decision-making process. Without this correlation, we will be unable to reach these objectives. Allow me to identify what science is. This is dialogue at the International Council for Sciences, and I'm merely quoting it and translating it. After a dialogue, when there was a fusion of the International Council of Sales in relation to a natural human sources with the social sciences. And we spoke in the morning of social sciences. Without the latter, we cannot achieve SDGs. Allow me to read the identification of science in relation to sustainable development. In order to better achieve the goals, science is an organized use of knowledge. It encompasses natural sciences and life sciences, including behavioral, economic, and human-related, medical-related, and computer-related sciences, as well as engineering. And we need really to delve into this identification in order to better see how we can reflect it in order to implement the objectives in the Arab region. As we know, the Agenda 2030 and the 17 SDGs, as well as the related targets, were linked to a transformative vision, considering that STI is a catalyst and an accelerator in order to achieve and implement SDGs. At the same time, they can be environment friendly. I'm not an economist, but at the same time, I found out that I had to learn some economics. If we want to work as a group, every major must be oriented towards cooperation with the other majors so that we will have an inclusive, comprehensive solution to implement the agenda. The team that is currently working on the preparation of the international report is formed in this way. I may be the only engineer there. The others are economists coming from social sciences backgrounds. Some are specialized in human geography. Therefore, this agenda opted for a transformative vision pertaining to development without being detrimental. This development should be according to a good GDP, to a good balance of payment, but it has to take into account the social and environmental impact. The 2030 agenda was formulated to be inclusive and comprehensive for sustainable development because it had to take into account the three main dimensions: social, economic, and environmental, adding to that human rights, peace, and security. It has to adopt also a major objective or principle of leaving no one behind. At the same time, it was somewhat intricate. The purpose of depicting the specificities of the agenda have to be correlated with why sciences must be linked to the decision-making process and how these sciences must work together in order to achieve the objective.
Now, the intricacy and the complementarity of this agenda made it all the more complex. However, this complexity is a source of enrichment, and this experience was inspired really from our expertise in the achievement of the MDGs. There was no linkages between these experiences and the achievement of these goals, but we learned our lesson and we used this lesson in achieving the 2030 agenda. Again, I repeat, I'm no economic experts, but this economic paradigm was developed in cooperation with some of the scientists working in Oxford. The source is Kate Rewards. In brief, I inserted this paradigm in my presentation, not with the aim of discussing it at length, but as a non-economic expert, I am fully convinced that this paradigm, or rather this model, is a very good and valid model for sustainable development. They baptized it donut economics. As you can see, this diagram resembles a donut. Dark and light green are used alongside red in this diagram. It shows how we can achieve economic development without harming the environment while guaranteeing decent social living for all citizens. The inner circle is meant to be empty, but at the same time, all available resources have to be exploited, namely water, energy, food, while in parallel providing all the other basic services such as health services and educational services so as to provide a decent way and level of living for citizens. But the ecological ceiling cannot be stepped over. If it is stepped over, then the adverse effects of climate change will be deeply and severely felt. Then biodiversity will be affected, land degradation will resurface, etc. So as I've said, the main aim of showing you this donut model is to tell you that any effort that is required to achieve these SDGs has to take this paradigm into account, whether we talk about water or food or climate change. Who will lay down the figures and numbers? Who will be conducting the studies? Of course, decision makers do not have the time to do so themselves. Therefore, it is necessary and it is of utmost importance for us to be in touch with the scientific circles, with the academia. Therefore, the effort has to be joined, it has to be done in consultation between decision makers and scientists. That being said, these goals remain guiding principles or guiding goals. For every region and every country, this agenda has to be adapted to suit the local prevailing reality. But most importantly, regardless of whether we focus on the internal or international level, without an adequate role being assigned to science, these goals will not be achieved. I have a question to ask here, perhaps to decision makers. If we look at the Arab region, to what extent can we really say that there is actual and effective cooperation between the scientific circles and decision-making circles? In my opinion, the answer is not to a great extent. But in light of what I've seen in the United Nations, even developed countries still discuss this dilemma. We need more work to be done on this front. And I still believe that a great role is to be played by the scientific and research circles. We have to come up with an innovative, creative, scientific and technological framework that is adequate and adapted to the current prevailing circumstances, while at the same time taking into account the requisites of the Sustainable Development Goals. But we have to remember that no paradigm can be imported from abroad and just parachuted and imposed on national frameworks and contexts. The 2030 Agenda and the SDGs have attracted the interest of the international community. And perhaps the acronym SDG is now the buzzword to attract funding. International mobility is gaining a lot of momentum in a way that is unprecedented, really, in a way that I've never seen in the past 20 or 30 years of experience that I've had in this field. I would like to tackle a number of challenges to conclude my presentation. Certain goals were defined with general terms. This needs the involvement of more scientists so that these goals are more accurately and precisely defined at the local level. Of course, the correlation between the targets and the goals is very, very complex, but it has to be discussed and tabled at the local level, and this can only take place through cooperation between the two wings of this equation. Because if at the academia or if scientists work without keeping touch with decision makers who actually know what money is available, who know the resources available and the list of priorities, then the goals and targets will never be achieved. In conclusion, sustainable development cannot be achieved without a proper positioning for science in the phases of planning, monitoring, and follow up, as well as implementation. There also has to be more participation from the scientific and academia circles, whether from anthropology, sociology, economics, or ecology, in order to achieve these goals. Of course, I have a recommendation for ASQA to take into account. Why not think of forming a scientific and academic Arab group that will focus primarily on the Arab region, just like other groups or committees that were formed by the United Nations. This emanated within the United Nations, with your permission, Doctor, because you're more knowledgeable about this. The United Nations actually realized that there's a shift in paradigms. It realized that we need an independent group of experts that does business not as usual, not like it used to be done in the past. So they deemed it adequate and convenient to have an independent group of scientists. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Doctor, for highlighting the importance of the role of sciences and the link between sciences and sustainable development in Arab countries. I'll give the floor now to Mr. Rami Shamma, currently holding the position of Program Manager at the Development for People and Nature Association in Lebanon, DPNA. He used to work as a civic education entrepreneurship teacher and also as a project manager for fostering free enterprise in youth at DPNA. Mr. Shamma holds a master's degree in computer engineering from Rafiq Hariri International University and a bachelor degree in computer and communication engineering. Thank you very much, Mr. Hassan, and thank you all for your attention. My approach to the topic will be slightly different from that of the speakers who spoke before me. And I truly urge you, each and every one of you, to review the latest developments that took place in the past few years, because many things and many phenomena that we see in our daily lives are closely related to the changes and the progress that are made around us. My mom always told me that had she had the same level of knowledge that she has today, but 10 years ago, then she would have made a lot of different choices in her life. This is only to show you and to tell you that we all go through experiences as we grow old. And as we grow old, we start to think more and more about future generations and about what's to come in the future. When we were young children and when we were still in school, we did not have the opportunity to learn about sustainable development or even to think about sustainable development. And this is very important. Now we know this for sure, because when a human being is still at a very young age, he or she has the capacity to learn more and grow more. This brings me to talk to you about the ownership of resources, natural resources. 20 years ago, did we have ownership of the natural resources that we have in our country? I personally did not. If you look at the educational systems that are currently applied in Lebanon, and if you take a tour around universities and schools and look at the consumption patterns of water and energy and electricity and resources such as books, papers, crayons, pencils, whether within the classroom or outside the classroom. So if you take such a tour, you'll realize how important it is for us to teach our children, our students over time, how to take ownership of the environment or the place that they live in or work in or learn in. It's very difficult for students to know by themselves at a very young age that the school is their property, that they are the owners of the school, and that if they harm any of the equipment or any of the resources that is made available to them on a daily basis, then they will be ultimately harming themselves. So a lot of work has to be done at this level. A lot of work has to be done at the level of educational systems and curricula so that we develop this sense of ownership among children and young students. Now, I have a question to you. Who liked economics at school? I see only a few hands. And now, if I ask you, what do you really remember of your economics lessons at school? I asked the same question to a group of friends that I regularly go out with, and the answer was not much. I only had two or three of my friends answer that they remember a lot of what they learned in economics. It is a very difficult subject indeed. Whenever you watch the news bulletin and then the economics section comes up, most of you actually take the remote and change the channel because it's a very technical topic. But at the same time, when students graduate from university and enter the labor market, they do so aspiring for good jobs and good salaries. So they are interested in economics, but there's a huge gap that separates one's experience, especially when one is young, and then the labor market and the economic cycle, because we all rely to a great extent on the economic cycle for livelihood. So there's this knowledge gap in the field of economics, and also there's another gap when it comes to education in the systems that prevail in our countries. When the Lebanese government was about to adopt new laws on taxes, a lot of new taxes were practically unknown to most of the Lebanese people. There was no real awareness about the positive and negative effects of any change to be introduced to our legislations, especially when it comes to the economic cycle. So there's a huge knowledge gap in this regard. But at the same time, when students enroll in universities, they find themselves obliged to go for one major or one specific specialization. I always knew that I wanted to be a computer engineer since I was 12 years old, maybe, simply because my father was a computer engineer and simply because this is all I saw growing up. So when I finished university, I joined the first company that I worked for. That was back in 2006, and I'm still working for the same company. But when I entered the labor market, I realized that engineering was not the major that I would have wanted to have for my entire life. So I found myself in a conundrum. Should I stick to what I know and continue studying and go to higher education in the same field, or should I shift to another major? And even within our families, we don't have a lot of awareness raising efforts from our parents for us to be properly oriented in the direction that best responds to our ambitions and to our passion, our drive, and what we aspire for in life, while at the same time being in line with the labor market needs. In Lebanon, there is a dire need for more awareness raising concerning the labor market needs and the available job opportunities and vacancies. To what extent can we say that we have proficient and properly qualified graduates that enter the labor market on a yearly basis? Most importantly, in sectors that are capable of guaranteeing sustainable development and the safeguarding of natural resources in a safe and sound manner. We have had a very interesting experience in our association pertaining to bridging this gap, this knowledge gap. We established a center for the training and for the teaching of young students on how to acquire labor skills. By labor skills, I mean day-to-day skills and practical skills for them to be able to adapt to any working environment that the young workers are joining. At the association, we receive over 90 CVs for one position, but out of these 90 CVs, I can only select 5 that are really capable and qualified to work within our association. And those are shortlisted and then are taken to interview stages. In this regard, I would like to note that this responsibility is incumbent upon not only governments, but also civil society and companies themselves, and also the private market that have to be able to bridge this gap, at least at this stage. Another topic that I'd like to table combines knowledge, skills, and attitudes. As individuals, we all have lifestyles, different lifestyles, but the one missing component is self-knowledge. We, the young generations, still do not know ourselves well enough. We still don't know when we have mood swings, when we feel happy, when we feel sad, when we have specific reactions. We cannot predict these reactions beforehand, and we cannot explain why our emotions and why our logic function the way they do. So, in our association, about a year ago, we launched a program that focuses mainly on extreme stress and control, or rather, profound stress and attunement. The theory behind this program stipulates that any person, any individual in this world goes through severe stress period, and you can go back in memory to such periods that you've personally experienced. When a human being goes through profound and severe stress over a specific period of time, under a given amount of stress, this individual develops reactions. These reactions, rather than being based on logic or rationale, become based on emotions and vice versa. So everything is inverted. And this is when confusion steps in. And this is when lack of knowledge seeps in. This is when we start wondering, was my reaction proportional to what I faced, or was it not? Was it out of proportion? And here, we took a look at the most recent publications in neuroscience. And it turned out that as individuals, we have to learn more and more about the system through which our minds and our brains function to know whether we need self-attunement or not. So in light of all of this, I can personally tell you that I benefited to a great extent from this program. The same applies to the youth and the persons that we work with in this program. You know that young people go through experiences all the time, and these experiences are increasingly stressful. Therefore, we have to know ourselves, we have to learn more about ourselves, about how to take care of ourselves, about how to treat ourselves and how to deal with ourselves in a way that preserves our safety and sanity. Because if we are well, then the environment surrounding us is well. If we live in an environment in which we find ourselves in dire need for the preservation of natural resources or environmental resources, or even human resources that are available to us, if we, on the inside, do not know ourselves well enough and do not work on learning more about ourselves, then we will never be able to feel this sense of ownership of the resources available to us, and we'll never be able to play the adequate role in providing this service, this preservation service, to everyone else. I'll conclude with one final thought. I was one of those people who wanted to steer away from public work or public life. And I know that the majority of young men and women in Arab countries think just like me, just like I did. So it's very important for us to find a way to reach out to these young men and women, to be able to involve them in this process, to be able to give them the sense of ownership of this process. And instead of being the only ones talking about sustainable development in a desert with no echo, we need to reach out to those people so that they also transpose the discussion into their circles. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Rami. You have highlighted the importance of public awareness raising on the importance of knowing oneself in order to be able to play an adequate role, whether for adults or for the young in this field. I'll give the floor to our fourth speaker, Mr. Suhail Marine, who is a regional expert and a consultant in technology and development. He holds a PhD in computer science, and he has 30 years of international experience or more in telecom, internet infrastructure, and information and communication technologies. He was formerly the head of the ICT Applications and Cybersecurity Division at the International Telecom Union in Geneva, the ITU in Switzerland. You have the floor, Mr. Sohail. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I have a few slides to present to you. I don't know whether the system is working. Thank you. I will be focusing in my presentation on two main issues, innovation and digital economy. These two are very intertwined and very closely related and play a major role in economic growth and development in Arab countries. My presentation will focus mainly for each one of these points on the concepts related to these points in the 21st century. We will, or rather I will try to present these concepts clearly and in a way that is consonant with the requisites of the current century that we are living in. And then I will conclude my presentation with a set of recommendations pertaining to these two main points. Innovation in the 21st century, according to a definition by the Oslo Guide, published by the OECD in 2005, states the following. It is the result of activities leading to new services or products or new marketing organization models in the practice of business activities. What does this mean? This means that innovation primarily has to be presenting a new product or service in a specific context, in a given context, and not in a general context. So an innovative product or an innovative service might be innovative in Lebanon, but might not be the same in another country. It has to be all-encompassing. It has to be overarching. Innovation cannot only be restricted to products or services. It has to also encompass and comprise business practices and the way that is adopted to do business and commerce. It also has to be related to science and technology, but also development. Sometimes innovation is a new application of already existent and already known technologies, and this is very important because it goes a step beyond the traditional and conventional paradigm of innovation as we know it, which is, for example, a center of research that publishes regular studies or regular researches about certain applications, and then companies come in and buy these applications, and then they launch the technological products onto the market. This definition takes a step forward, a step beyond this conventional and traditional definition, which means that clients of these products and services can actually contribute to the improvement of these products and in upgraded versions of these products. Scientific companies also can cooperate with such innovative establishments, which leads me to my next point. We are living in a globalized economic world. We have international value chains. This means, for example, this small device that you carry in your pocket 24/7. This device is a unique model that can translate international value chains. This means that this device is based on patents, on marketing labels that might be emanating from a country. It is assembled in a B country, and an ecosystem of the software is introduced in this device emanating from X, Y, or Z countries. Developing countries have been very fortunate and were able to ride the wave of these international value chains. And as Arab states, we also have to try to keep abreast with the developments of this international value chain. Because when China started manufacturing these devices, it was only a manufacturing country. All of the pieces were brought in from abroad, and China only assembled, or rather manufactured, parts of this device. Other developing countries decided to ride the wave of assembly, and they started assembling these parts in order to present a complete product. Another equally important point. We are currently living amidst a new industrial revolution. Many technologies saw the light But many other technologies are still in the pipeline, such as neurological technologies, for example, or nuclear technologies. The first report of sustainable development published by the United Nations in 2016 included a whole chapter dedicated to discussing these industrial revolutions. The current industrial revolution will produce winners and losers, just like its predecessors. But this time, losers will be losing everything. The loss will be tremendous, and the winners will be very big winners, and the success that they will enjoy will be tremendous. Therefore, we have to try and ride this wave, not only in terms of improving our technologies and trying to purchase these technologies, because they have become vital and necessary for the human survival. I will not delve into the details of this slide, but I can tell you in a nutshell that this graph represents the national system of innovation. The main drive, or rather the main catalyst of this system, is the educational system. And this educational system actually produces the outputs of education and the new labor market entrants. If this relationship breaks down, then the main catalyst or the main engine behind the national system for innovation will break down. Unfortunately, this is the case prevailing currently in Arab countries. There is no correlation, there is no linkage between educational establishments, universities, and labor market institutions. This is the main engine, this is the driving force behind the national innovation system. It's like the engine of a car. It needs air and it needs fuel. It is fed by subject circumstances, it is fed by economic circumstances, it's fed by investments, and this is the fuel of it. It is also fed by the financial market and the labor market and also the economic market. Therefore, whenever we are to measure the preparedness and the readiness of any given state to be a producer of innovation, a number of topics have to be factored in, not only the money factor, or not only the financial capacity of that country, or not only the number of researchers and scientists that work in that country. There's a number of elements that have to be factored in whenever assessing the effectiveness of this national innovation system. And it is a main key for the success of these companies and these emerging markets that will further create more biodiversity and more employment diversity in the Arab region. Well, in brief, allow me to tell you what are the pillars of innovation in the Arab region. First of all, we have very low investment and expenditure on innovation and research. In industrialized countries, 2% of the GDP is spent on innovation and research, whereas in Arab countries, the same rate ranges between 0.1, 0.2, or 0.3 tops. Some countries did reach 0.7 at times, and some others set the target at 1%. But qualitatively and quantitatively equally, we are still lagging way behind the spending levels of industrialized and developed countries. So the overall spending of Arab countries on innovation and science does not exceed the third of what is spent by one industrialized state such as South Korea, and 1/5 of what OECD countries spend. This is only to give you an idea, a comparative idea of the challenge that still lies ahead. Also, there's a very severe weakness in the linkages between the productive sector and the research and innovation centers. The main problem at this level still lies at the level of the weak presence of this sector, which is still confined to national research centers or university research centers and labs. It is not present at all in the productive sectors. I'm not just making judgments in an arbitrary way, but in general, the linkages are still very, very weak. We also have policies in place to encourage and catalyze investments, but resources in this field are still very dire. Budgets are still very limited and restricted, and they are not related to the qualitative development of such initiatives. So, in a nutshell, our countries are still not allocating the necessary importance and the priority that is adequate for these fields. Certain countries have made promises in this regard. Certain countries already have investments, such as the UAE, which already has established a policy for science and technology at the highest level of the government. But this policy is still confined to one ministry without all the others. And with all due respect to decision makers in that ministry, honestly, they do not have the prerogative or even the power to roll out this strategy in a way that engulfs all of the sectors, because science and technology is not restricted to one field. It is an overarching strategy that has to encompass all factors of the state.
So what we need is a whole of government approach, as they call it in English. Some young entrepreneurs are being encouraged. Unfortunately, the economic structure that the moderator has referenced in the beginning keeps those from becoming productive companies. Why? Because in the Arab region, financing and funding SMEs is very weak. The World Bank indicator, the indicator called doing business, on the how easy it is to start up businesses, the marks for the Arab countries, even GCC countries, and I reiterate that, even GCC countries, all of these marks, all of their grades are really bad. Another weakness, resolving bad debts and bankruptcy situations. It is a risk. There is always this risk. In many Arab countries, that might lead you to prison. You might end up in prison. In brief and very quickly, I would like to speak of the digital economy, which is a main component of the Industrial Revolution, and its impacts on all sectors. This digital economy will introduce radical changes, especially in the modern technologies, artificial intelligence, and robots. A McKinsey report says, issued last year, indicated that from now to 2030, 15% of the world job opportunities might be replaced, and if digital technologies are fully adopted and integrated with an average and a very moderate scenario. This is a major challenge to us. Why? Because that means we need to build the capacities of our human beings in an aligned manner to what we call the non-routine skills. The skills that are not the day-to-day skills, because those routine skills will be replaced by machines. The digital economy has a direct impact on economic development. Why? Because it also creates job opportunities, and it requires national digital policies. I will not delve much into the situation of supply and demand within the digital economy, but let me say one thing. The diagnosis of this situation in the Arab world is somewhat average. However, the use of digital technologies is limited, and it's unknown in statistical terms. So we do not have the data so that we say this is where the digital economy is being used in companies and industries, and how it is contributing to the development of SMEs. And I remind you that these constitute 80 to 90% of the GDPs in the Arab countries, without taking into consideration the GCC countries, and they take up around 70% of employment and job opportunities. So this sector or the use of the digital technology within the SMEs is not known in terms of statistics. So the digital economy contributes to the elaboration of this sector, to the development of this sector, to incorporating it within the official economy. And you know that our main problem is the informality of this sector, of the economy, which has the largest share of employment. Recommendations: we need to improve monitoring and evaluation. Many statistics are not available, many indicators are not available, and these do not only pertain to innovation, they also relate to the digital economy. What we cannot measure cannot be managed. You know that. Second, we need to incentivize innovation for the sake of development at all levels: large-scale companies, small and medium enterprises, and the new approaches to innovation, the baseline innovation approaches, and the civil society innovations. These initiatives should be encouraged. Also, we need to have new approaches on ICT strategies, linking sciences and ICTs to the challenges of development. And last but not least, we need digital strategies to incentivize and encourage digital industries, develop digital services in all digital sectors, in all, be it public or private sectors. Thank you for your active listening. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Marine. I believe you raised very valuable points, and I sum them up by focusing on the weak and the scarce resources to develop the digital sector in the Arab world. Also, the new technologies, the modern and digital technologies makes it that the winner takes it all. This is the situation. And the loss, thus, will be major. A fourth important point was the need to take this illusion away when it comes to startups and personal initiatives or entrepreneurship. We need to address this and develop these perspectives in the Arab world. We should not be amazed with the way things are at the time being. Thank you. And let me open the floor now for questions and answers. Adib Naami, an advisor, a development advisor, a development consultant, and I've been working with the ASQA for some time, until recently. Stopping at Dr. Diba's intervention, the questions that you raised, sir, are extremely important, and they cut to the heart of the subject. My questions, rather a recommendation to push this discussion further ahead. Oliver Schomburg, he is a German researcher who conducted empirical studies on some Arab economies. In his description of our capitalism, he used the term patrimonial capitalism. So, patrimonial capitalism. This means to understand our economic mechanism, there are some economic concepts that are no longer enough. If we want to marry the economy to the politics, the economy is not bound by economic reasoning or logic. So can we take a step further and adopt such innovative and advanced concepts? Second, the role of science I believe that the role of science is first and foremost criticism, critical thinking, and critical approaches. The World Council for Sciences, after less than years of the adoption of Agenda 2030, issued a report from the perspective, from the perspective of the targets, said that 29%, only 29% of the targets are smart, and the rest should be revisited. If we do not have a science that gives us this, I believe we will remain working aimlessly. So I'm not saying that science organizations and groups should be plotting with governments and other organizations. They have to be purely scientific. Another point, I would like to argue on that idea related to the thinking pattern. Think as usual, leaving no one behind. There are requirements at this stake. We can no longer adopt things as they are. A digital revolution that changed things overnight, and there will be no longer any job opportunities. Who says so? It's not technology nor the industrial revolution that leads to this. What leads to this situation is the economic and industrial systems. We need to revisit our working hours and our working shifts to enhance productivity. If we have enhanced productivity, we can think of more flexible working patterns. If people think of or come up with transportation means that save energy, why should we stick to the traditional means? So we need to think of things in a different manner, from a different perspective. It's not winning something does not mean the others are losing something. Thank you, sir. Maybe we need to answer every question separately, or should we take a round of questions and then we answer all questions from the Sudan?
طيب شكرا جزيلا السيد.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Thank you, the dear panelists, esteemed panelists. My comments on the last intervention on the international chains, the value chains. We were talking about the dimension of integration in economies. If we focus on enhancing regional value chains, this will enhance the international value chains, namely that many of our Arab countries are part of the African continent. Many Arab African countries are members of regional economic organizations. In March, the African Free Zone trade agreement was signed. So we have the opportunity to diversify our economy. How? Through our economic conglomerations, our economic blocks, and that would allow us better access to international platforms. So my point, we need to take into consideration the sustainable development dimensions and social dimensions, but we need as well to take into consideration the economic integration dimension. There are so many interlinkages at this stake. Many of our Arab countries have join other countries in those clusters and conglomerations. So we need to use these in order to have this international visibility. And that would allow us to think in better, in a more enhanced perspective in terms of economic diversification. Thank you. Salima Misbah Al-Fakhri, the head of women empowerment and women and youth empowerment in Libya. Question to His Excellency the Minister Janabi. The Iraqi experience is so similar to the Libyan experience. Now we are facing a dire economic situation and many political mishappenings. You have spoken about economic diversification and the substitute, the economy that will substitute the rent economy. So, what was the approach? Those economic substitutes, were they small and medium enterprises? What were the alternatives, and what was the role of the state at that level? Was it soft loans? Was it incentives? How did you, what was your take on that? Sometimes when we experience similar circumstances, there would be opportunities for projects that would benefit the state's treasury. Did you do that? Also, the role of municipalities, the local governance, did it play a role in the development, in creating an alternative vision for development, replacing the use of fuel sources? Because we were focused so much on the fuel, on the oil, and we have suffered a great deal. So now we have more tendency to move to other natural resources. Many of the alternatives are being thought of now, and that is a different situation. Now we're focused as a civil society. We have to bridge those gaps. We have to step up and fill the role of the state where the state is failing. So we're trying to encourage the involvement of the youth, of the women providers. So we had a number of initiatives to support the youth, to support them in social integration. So maybe we need to think of ways how to support these initiatives. نادين بيطار، سؤال فريق العلماء من المتحدثين. مؤخرا كان هناك دراسة في كندا حول المدن والتغير المناخي. تقرير صدر عن أحد التقارير، وهذا التقرير نظر في كيفية أو في البدائل من أجل أو البدائل وأخذ البيانات العلمية في اقتراح طرق من أجل التصدي لتغير المناخ.
And this regards Thomas.
سؤال آخر لتوماس بيكيتي الذي تكلم عن الاقتصاد.
But you have also Hernando Di Soto who talks about land and how we can, by increasing the land tenure for the urban poor, we can also include them in the formal economy.
تفضل.
أنا النائب معتز أبو رمان من الأردن.
Of the Financial Commission within the Parliament. A question to the economic expert, Mr. Suhair. We were speaking about the digital economy. Many markets in this part of the world, specifically in the Middle East, are rather consuming, not productive markets. Now, economies are turning into digital systems, and communications, means of transportation, procurement means are taking new new directions, and they are going beyond local markets. The risk that threatens the economies makes it that we need to go for the economy of services, which might generate a new economic dimension that can create a new space for small and medium enterprises as well as large-scale businesses. I think that we don't have time for more than one question. Mustafa Nasser, the head of the Economic Science and Studies Center in Yemen. Question. Talking about the diversification of economic resources in the Arab countries, moving from the rent economy to productive economies, unfortunately, sometimes we tend to speak a very old language. It seems that we're not achieving much positive. We did not achieve much positive results through in the last decades. I think sometimes we miss the right problem. We tend to forget that corruption, marrying politics to money is one of the main reasons. Money is one of the main reason to this shortcoming. I think the transformation to a digital economy will entail a huge loss on this marriage between politics and money, and I think we omit to discuss that. Second point, on the use of technologies and technological tools. Many youth in our Arab countries are now making use of the digital era to become entrepreneurs, but the challenges are many, and my question is on the technical side. Sometimes you have enterprises with huge capacities, with huge capabilities and potentials, and they will reap the fruits they will reap the fruits. And we would be talking about success models, success stories that did not turn into economic institutions and an economy of knowledge that is beneficial to all. I will take another round of questions if we still have time. I will leave it to the panelists to answer the questions, and I have a couple of comments. A question asked by Mr. Adib on the critical thinking and the critical thinking approaches that are needed. Can you answer us, sir? I might have a different perspective. I might have a different opinion. We're talking here about cooperation. So we need to be independent in our opinions. Yes, criticism should be frank and straightforward, but we shouldn't compromise the proofs, the scientific proofs at the end of the day. In the agenda, in its preparation, in its implementation, and its the follow-up on implementation, scientific data will be consulted, but we cannot limit all the approach to critical thinking approaches. Mr. Adib asked a number of questions and then he left the room apparently. On the thinking, the pattern of thinking, the way we think, I think maybe we're speaking about the general people's thinking of how to manage technologies and technological usages. The way of thinking is rather related to the way we carry ourselves in our lives. Boys and girls, men and women, are not, it seems that they're not knowing how to use the technologies that are available to them. We're not being able to make use of the resources we have, be it technological, be it natural, or any other type of resources. Maybe we should start by ourselves, and then at a second level, we should work with the institutions we belong to, the governments, and our governments, our parliaments, our non-governmental organizations or private sector enterprises. Do we really know what the SDGs mean? Are we fully aware of the concept of sustainable development? We need to cultivate this way of thinking at an early age and starting with ourselves. Second, we need to focus on success stories and life stories, because that is the one thing that impact most people, the individual. If you see your peer who had experienced a very difficult economic situation, could not find a job, and then thanks to some trainings and working on their skills and improving their skills, and then they could achieve something, that would encourage me. That would push me to take the initiative and do something, actually. So we need to focus on success stories and those stories that can impact us positively. Thank you. And Rami reminded me of that issue. To which extent are we aware of the sustainable development objectives or sustainable development as a concept? We have launched a questionnaire, actually, on this issue by an international federation for scientific organizations. The results, the outcomes were really surprising. Many of the academic circle, academic figures, knew little about this, even at the level of definition. The definition of those objectives were unknown to many. So what Rami said is so right. It's not only an ignorance within at the grassroots level, it's also within the academic circle as well. On the question asked by the Sudan on the international value chains, Dr. Suhail, thank you. I agree with you, madam. I gave my presentation very quickly, and I did not speak of those factors that keep us from being part of international value chains. ASQA issued a very important report a few years ago about Arab integration. Without Arab integration, it goes without saying that we will not be part of international value chains. End of. Second, being part of international value chains, it's not about knocking doors. It will not be knocking doors. We need to push the door, and we need to go with full force. China, Korea, Asian countries that became part of international value chains were not invited to the process. We should become cognizant of this as Arabs. It's part of our culture. We tend to be dependent. We need to help ourselves, and we need to force ourselves into that, to become part of the international value chains. The question from Libya to His Excellency the Minister. Thank you for the question. There are certainly similarities between the two experiences. Yes, we might be ahead of you. After 2003, we know that a huge wealth was created was generated in Iraq. Unfortunately, those who held the largest share of this wealth were not producers. There are speculations, prices skyrocketing, including real estate prices. So this wealth was owned by some people who were not producers, and we could not feel this wealth helping the development side. On the issue of small enterprises and small businesses, I think it is the way to go. In Iraq, before 2003, you know, we were a huge central state with a big ideology, with a huge tendency towards domination. You know that thinking that one solution was the magic solution was a failure. The small enterprises, the small businesses did not set off from a specific premise. The government is now leaning towards large-scale enterprises and businesses, and we're relying on many national companies that can provide job opportunities for some job seekers. But on the production side, we're not doing well. You know that the Abadi government over the last 2 years has encouraged the small and medium enterprises despite the deficient budget. So a large share of the budget was dedicated to the small and medium enterprises. We're talking about 5 billion. I don't think it created a paradigm shift. It didn't give us this quantum leap, but it changed something. Also, we had seen increased returns and some budget surplus. So we have thought of supplementary budgets to distribute those wealth. And we also had what we call the agricultural initiative, whereby we donated large amounts of money to revive the agricultural sector, but the results were not really concrete or tangible because the focus was only on one aspect of the food system. So the experience was not extremely successful, and it ended without a major progress in the agricultural sector also. And you asked about the municipalities and the role of the local councils.
Iraq was turned from a highly centralized state to a dictatorship run by a single person or by a single political party. It turned into a state that has become decentralized. We tried to give prerogatives and authorities to local authorities, such as the governorates councils that are elected and newly saw the light. But all of these councils had their own budget called the Governorate Development Budget, and these were highly budgets away from the central budget of the state, and we have had many high hopes pinned on the development of the governorates, knowing that we are a third world country and development used to occur only in the capital, and the capital would attract people from different governorates and provinces in Iraq. Therefore, the numbers inflated due to the lack of job opportunities in the rural areas. Therefore, we tried to develop these rural areas to lessen the burden off the shoulders of the capital. But in light of the lack of capacities in these governorates, and these elected councils are not necessarily attractive to the best professional people there. There might be a confessional factor, a tribal factor that might come in play. Therefore, I do not believe that they will service their main target, notably a lot of the fact that the oil prices collapsed before all of these projects, or the majority of these projects, were complete. Therefore, the development of these governorates is crucial. but there is no longer any budget for the development of these governorates, and it is not possible to feed these projects from other budgets. We also have the law of investment, which is one of the most instrumental laws that was enacted in 2006. It is a highly developed law that allows investors to invest within Iraq and safeguards their available rights. All of these rights are numerous that might not be available in other neighboring countries. But unfortunately, these laws were not really fruitful because the investment environment is not highly attractive for numerous reasons, out of which the political stability that did not happen completely in Iraq. Furthermore, Iraq fell victim to terrorism and continuous terrorist attacks and regional and international interventions that did not really create an effective investment environment. But the law is there, and we hope that in the last 2 years we were able to achieve military and security milestones and some political stability. And now, after freeing some Iraqi cities, we will try to show the other facets of all of these changes. Thank you, Your Excellency. Time is up. We would like to thank you all for your participation. We would like to thank all the panelists, Dr. Mohammed, Mr. Rami, His Excellency Minister Hassan, and Dr. Suhail for this very important panel, and thank you for participating.
شكرا جزيلا. شكرا دكتور غسان ديب على رئاسة